Tonight we're going to ease into something that looks terrifying at first glance but, strangely enough, carries one of the calmest and most misunderstood histories in medicine, the plague doctor mask. Imagine this, a dim alley in 17th century Europe, cobblestones slick with rain, torchlight trembling on plaster walls, and at the end of that narrow street you spot a figure. Not running. Not panicking. Just strolling, head slightly tilted, with a long beak jutting from their face. You feel your chest tighten, because it looks like some nightmare bird has stepped out of a fever dream. You probably won't survive this, at least, that's what anyone in that era would have thought. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first glimpse of the plague doctor mask is all about contrast. Here's this bird-like silhouette, alien against the flickering warmth of candles or the pale glow of a cloudy moon, and yet there's no frenzy in how the figure moves. You expect a shriek or a chase, but instead there's measured calm, as if the person behind that mask has long accepted their role as a quiet observer of suffering. The mask, oddly enough, was less about horror in its own time and more about an attempt at control, like a child clutching a blanket against the dark. You picture the long, curved beak, its outline catching little gleams of shell gold in the edges of an old manuscript. The beak is smooth, almost elegant, and the dark round eyes reflect firelight like glass marbles. Behind those lenses, a human blinks slowly, shielded from both disease and the sight of too much tragedy. The effect is chilling, but also strangely serene, like someone choosing stillness while the world burns. Here's the mainstream fact. The mask as we imagine it, beak, goggles, heavy robes, really took shape in the 17th century, most often associated with France and Italy. But here's a quirky tidbit. The earliest surviving illustrations show the mask not in a doctor's hand at work, but in satirical drawings, like political cartoons mocking how useless doctors supposedly were. That means the first people to really see the beak doctor may have laughed as much as they trembled. Historians still argue whether the mask was ever widely worn in everyday plague care, or if it was more symbolic than practical. The calmness in that first encounter comes from the contrast between expectations and reality. You think plague equals chaos, screams, coughing, frantic flight, but the mask figure glides like a patient chess piece. The beak doesn't flap, the gown doesn't swish with drama, the cane moves rhythmically with each step. It's like a metronome in a city symphony of panic. If you've ever been the one calm friend at a chaotic party, you know the vibe. Everyone else is flailing, and you're just sipping water in the corner, silently counting down until it ends. You imagine yourself in the shoes, or rather, the beaked mask of one of these doctors. The smell of vinegar wafts faintly from the herbs stuffed in the beak. Your breath fogs the glass lenses, and the world outside looks slightly distorted, like you're underwater. Children might scream at the sight, adults might cross themselves, but you don't speed up. You're paid not to panic. The cane in your hand touches the stones with a tap tap tap, the sound echoing through narrow streets like a heartbeat that refuses to race. That eerie calmness in the mask's history is why it endures. Unlike most medieval symbols of disease, which are grotesque or grotesquely exaggerated, the beaked mask is almost gentle in its strangeness. It doesn't bare teeth. It doesn't drip blood. It hides the human face not with rage but with a bird's neutral gaze. It's the quiet guest at the masquerade, standing still while everyone else dances themselves into exhaustion. Even now, if you close your eyes and picture it, you don't see action, you see stillness. A pause between heartbeats. A figure frozen in time while plague winds howl past. There's dread, yes, but it's wrapped in calm ritual, like lighting incense in a storm. That tension between fear and composure is the thread we'll keep pulling tonight. And as the torchlight flickers, you find yourself strangely drawn to the mask, not away from it. Maybe because it embodies something we crave during chaos, steadiness. Maybe because the mask, for all its strangeness, is a reminder that people have always tried to face fear with ritual, even if the ritual looks ridiculous centuries later. Or maybe it's just the beak. It's hard not to stare at a face that looks halfway between a crow and a carnival trick. But that's the doorway we step through tonight. Behind it lies the deeper story, where this mask came from, why it looks the way it does, and how it fluttered, sometimes terrifying, sometimes laughable, through centuries of European history. And as you settle deeper into the pillow, the figure in the mask doesn't move any closer. It just waits, calmly, until you're ready to follow. You're still following that calm, bird-faced silhouette, but now the path takes you back further than the 17th century. Before the long beak mask became an icon, there were centuries of whispered fears, whispered cures, and whispered prayers in candlelit chapels. The plague had been crashing through Europe since the mid-1300s, and people were desperate for anything that felt protective. But back then, no one had yet settled on the famous bird look. Instead, you would have seen charms dangling from belts, rosaries rubbed raw from anxious fingers, and little cloth bags of herbs tied under the chin. The mask wasn't born fully formed, it crept in slowly, like fog seeping into a valley. The mainstream fact is this: during the Black Death of the 14th century, the terrifying pandemic that killed tens of millions, there's almost no evidence of beaked masks. Doctors and healers instead wrapped scarves over their mouths, soaked sponges in vinegar, or held flowers up to their noses. They believed in the miasma theory, that foul, corrupted air carried disease, so filtering smells became a logical, if shaky, shield. Quirky tidbit: some households burned rosemary or juniper in every room, filling homes with such dense smoke that neighbors joked you couldn't see the wallpaper. Imagine accidentally inventing the world's least fun fog machine. Historians still argue whether early doctors ever wore primitive face covers resembling later masks. Some claim there were rudimentary leather hoods, while others think these are myths retrofitted after the famous design became popular. You can picture a medieval physician, wrapped in a heavy robe, squinting at a patient while clutching a pomander, a little metal ball stuffed with spices, like a stress toy. It looks almost comical now, but in an age where invisible death floated through the air, you take comfort however you can. As you trudge through a medieval street in your imagination, the smells overwhelm you. Rotting food, unwashed bodies, and yes, that sharp tang of vinegar-soaked cloth pressed against someone's lips. There's no sleek leather beak here yet, just makeshift protection that barely hides the desperation behind it. Even so, you catch a strange calmness. People line up outside shrines, dropping coins into bowls for masses to be said. Some wear little talismans of Saint Sebastian, the plague saint, arrows piercing his body in tiny silver relief. It's almost serene, the way belief soothes panic, even when death tolls climb higher each week. The whispers about plague masks before they truly existed are part of this calm. You hear stories of foreign lands where healers supposedly wear strange bird-like faces. Were these tales based on reality, or were they medieval urban legends? Hard to say. Just as today someone might swear they saw Bigfoot in the woods, a villager back then might tell you they heard of Italian doctors hiding behind bird snouts. But when pressed, there's no evidence at the time, just rumor. Still, the seed was planted. People already thought of covering the face as a line of defense, and people already associated birds with omens. So when the iconic mask eventually appeared, it didn't seem invented out of thin air, it felt like the physical embodiment of centuries of whispered half-measures. And here's where the calmness sneaks in again. When you think of plague, you imagine frenzy, people rushing, priests shouting. But most of the time, life simply slowed. Streets emptied. Families stayed indoors. Whole towns went quiet except for the toll of bells. If anything, the plague's rhythm was lethargic. Not a hurricane, but a long fog. And the seeds of the mask's history reflect that same sluggishness, slow evolution, slow adoption, slow drift from rumor into leather and glass. Picture yourself in Florence around 1400. A cart rolls by, pulled by a donkey. The driver wears no mask, just a rag tied over his face, smelling faintly of garlic. Behind him, someone coughs under layers of blankets. And yet there's no stampede, no shouting. Just a quiet acceptance, as if people have already burned through their panic. That calm resignation is more frightening than screams, because it feels final, like the world itself has taken a deep, tired breath. The proto-mask years weren't about bold inventions, they were about improvisation. And the whispers of strange coverings weren't about spectacle, they were about comfort. Even if a face cloth or pomander did nothing, it created ritual. And ritual, as you've probably noticed, is the human race's favorite way of soothing the uncontrollable. The beak mask may not yet exist in this part of the journey, but you can feel it gathering shape, like clay being kneaded before it's sculpted. Rumors, talismans, scarves, pomanders, they're all little breadcrumbs leading toward the figure you first glimpsed under torchlight. It's not a sudden invention, but a slow layering of fear, faith, and faintly ridiculous accessories, waiting for someone bold enough or eccentric enough to codify them into that unforgettable silhouette. The mask finally begins to take on its bird-like silhouette, and you can almost watch the design stretch its wings in slow motion across Europe. Until now, you've seen cloths, scarves, pomanders, and smoky rooms, messy improvisations. But something in the human imagination loves shapes, and the shape that stuck was the bird. The beak, specifically. A strange choice, isn't it? Out of all possible symbols, why lean into something that looks like a crow sniffing out carrion? The mainstream fact is that the plague doctor mask we recognize, with its long, hollow beak, starts showing up in 17th century engravings and descriptions. The reasoning was simple enough. If you believe in bad air carrying disease, then you need a space to stuff sweet-smelling herbs and spices. A hollow beak gives you a chamber for that. Practical, yes, but also theatrical. Imagine strolling into a patient's home looking like a stork on a business trip. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some masks weren't long and elegant at all. Surviving examples and sketches suggest a variety of lengths, some more like short snouts, others so exaggerated they looked like comedy props. One Venetian satirist joked that doctors should be careful not to trip over their own noses when bowing. Historians still argue whether these variations reflect regional styles or simply artistic exaggeration. Did a French doctor genuinely wear a beak so long it brushed his collar, or was that just an illustrator having fun? No one's entirely sure. The beak shape also carried a symbolic undertone. Birds had long been associated with omens, especially crows and ravens, which were seen circling battlefields and plague pits. By adopting that silhouette, doctors may have looked terrifying, but they also looked inevitable, like the bird of death itself had decided to help take notes. Picture yourself as a sick villager. You open your door and see not a human, but a figure with glassy round eyes and a curved beak looming above you. Do you feel comfort? Probably not. But maybe you feel order, the sense that someone, even death's own assistant, has come to acknowledge your suffering. The calmness in this bird-like silhouette is oddly ironic. You'd think the costume would amplify panic. Yet it did the opposite. It standardized fear. Instead of an unknown, faceless disease creeping through town, there was now a clear icon for it. A symbol you could point at, whisper about, and eventually mock. It's like having a logo for catastrophe. Familiarity softens the edge of terror, even if the shape itself is eerie. As you imagine one of these doctors walking slowly down a narrow street, the beak juts forward like a compass needle. Each step is measured, the cane tapping like a metronome. Children peek from behind shutters and whisper the crow doctor is here, while parents hush them with a mixture of fear and relief. The doctor's eyes, hidden behind rounded glass, give nothing back. You could wave, and it would look the same as a cough or a cry for help, just foggy reflections in two dark circles. Here's where the calm tone deepens. The beak turned the doctor into something less human. Less human meant less emotionally vulnerable. You couldn't see the doctor's grimace, or their tired sigh. The mask created distance, not just against miasma, but against despair. A strange serenity comes with that separation, like a monk's hood or a knight's visor. You become an emblem rather than a person, which oddly helps when you're surrounded by chaos. Of course, the silhouette wasn't universally admired. Satirical prints loved to exaggerate it, turning doctors into waddling geese. Festivals in Venice later adopted the look for comedy, where the beak became more clownish than chilling. You might even hear musicians poking fun, playing a little ditty as a doctor strolled by, the beak bobbing like a metronome to the beat. Yet despite the laughter, the shape endured, precisely because it had become iconic. Imagine slipping the mask on yourself. You feel the weight of the leather straps, the slight pull against your cheeks, the faint smell of wax used to waterproof the material. Breathing is strange, filtered, muffled, like whispering through a cardboard tube. Vision narrows into two perfect circles. The beak, stuffed with herbs, makes each breath smell faintly of mint, cloves, or roses, depending on your budget. Ridiculous? Maybe. Comforting? Absolutely. And that's the secret of the bird-like silhouette. It looks horrifying from the outside, but from the inside it was a little greenhouse of calm. Each inhale reminded the doctor that they had a pocket of purity in a world of rot. Each exhale fogged the lenses, reminding them they were shielded from the sight of agony. In its own odd way, the beak mask was less about terrifying others and more about soothing the one who wore it. So the bird shape wasn't just an accident of superstition, it was an act of design, theatrical and symbolic, practical and absurd. A silhouette that calmed the healer, unsettled the patient, and gave artists and jokers endless material. And from here, the mask had its champion, the man bold enough to codify the whole outfit into the uniform of an era. Now you trail the beaked silhouette until it merges into one man's shadow, the French physician Charles Delorme. If the mask was still a half-formed rumor, Delorme is the figure who tightened the straps, straightened the seams, and declared, "Yes, this is the look." In the early 1600s, he served as personal doctor to kings Louis XIII and Louis XIV of France, plus their families. You can almost picture him standing in his study, quill in hand, sketching the long-beaked mask with the same seriousness as if he were designing royal attire. The mainstream fact is that Charles Delorme is widely credited with codifying the plague doctor outfit in 1619. His uniform included the leather gown, gloves, boots, cane, and of course the mask with its hollow beak for stuffing aromatic herbs. What had been scattered improvisations became a standardized ensemble under his watch. Quirky tidbit. He was also known for his eccentric medical theories, including elaborate bloodletting regimens and the liberal use of enemas. Imagine your doctor prescribing both a terrifying crow mask and a morning cleanse. It's a wonder he had time to treat anyone at all. Historians still argue whether Delorme truly invented the whole thing or merely formalized practices that already existed. Some say Italian doctors were already experimenting with similar masks. Others suggest he simply gave the costume a French royal stamp of approval, which made it stick. Whatever the case, his name became tied to the mask like a signature on a painting. Picture Delorme introducing his outfit to a skeptical town council. He clears his throat, unrolls a parchment, and explains the virtues. The gown is waxed leather, impervious to air. The gloves and boots prevent contamination. The beak holds herbs to filter miasma. You imagine the councilmen nodding gravely, even as they suppress giggles at the sight of their doctor dressed like a leather raven. It's like your dentist showing up in a full Batman costume and insisting it's purely for safety. But here's where the calmness settles in again. Delorme wasn't proposing hysteria, he was proposing order. The plague had torn through towns in chaotic bursts, and communities were desperate for ritual and uniformity. A standardized doctor's outfit was a way of saying, "We're not helpless. We have a system. We even have a dress code." That kind of message soothes the nerves, even if the science is shaky. As you imagine slipping into his invention, you notice the careful layering. First, the linen undergarments. Then the heavy leather gown, coated with wax or suet until it shines faintly in torchlight. Gloves slide over your fingers, boots over your feet, all tied tightly with cords. Finally, the mask, snug leather straps biting into your scalp, lenses narrowing your vision, beak stuffed with herbs releasing a faint perfume. You adjust the cane in your hand, not just for walking, but for poking patients from a safe distance. The transformation is complete. You're no longer an individual, you're the plague doctor. Of course, it wasn't all serene. Patients sometimes screamed when they saw the mask. Children cried. The outfit made you look like a bird of prey, descending on the weak. Yet there's an undeniable calm authority in that image too. You are untouchable, armored against death itself. When everyone else is frantic, you stride slowly, protected by leather, glass, and ritual. Here's a strange thought. Delorme's invention might have been less about medicine than about psychology. It created an aura of control. The mask gave the impression that the doctor was shielded from contagion and could therefore face the chaos with composure. It didn't matter that the herbs inside the beak did little against bacteria. What mattered was the symbol. Like a knight's armor or a priest's robes, the costume turned the doctor into a role rather than a person. And that role rippled through history. Artists picked it up, satirists skewered it, carnival goers mimicked it. But in this moment, in Delorme's time, the mask was earnest, an honest attempt to bring calm to streets that reeked of panic. He may not have been the first to imagine a bird-like filter, but he was the first to say, "This is who we are when the plague comes." So when you see that first torchlit figure again, remember there's a man behind the design, a physician to kings, who thought dressing like a crow was the best way to soothe both himself and the world. And maybe, in its odd theatricality, he was right. You follow the leather-clad silhouette closer, curious about what's hidden inside that strange bird's beak. It's not empty space, it's a miniature apothecary, a portable herb garden dangling off your face. The logic was simple. If plague spread through bad air, then good air could block it. And what better way to breathe good air than to inhale roses, cloves, or vinegar with every breath? The mask was less a medical device and more a wearable potpourri jar. The mainstream fact: contemporary accounts describe plague doctors stuffing their beaks with a range of materials, dried flowers, herbs like rosemary or mint, spices such as cloves or nutmeg, and even vinegar-soaked sponges. All of it aimed at purifying the air before it entered the lungs. The quirky tidbit: some doctors allegedly experimented with more pungent fillers, like camphor or even crushed garlic. Imagine trying to soothe a patient while your breath smells like an aggressively seasoned pizza. Historians still argue whether these recipes were standardized or improvised. Did each doctor follow a written guide, or did they just grab whatever herbs they had lying around the kitchen shelf? The evidence is patchy, which makes the beak's contents as mysterious as its shape. Imagine yourself sliding cloves into the narrow cavity, arranging rose petals over them, then dampening a little sponge in vinegar. The beak becomes heavy with fragrance. You lower it over your face, and suddenly the outside world, the stink of sickness, the rot of unwashed streets, the smoke from too many burning incense sticks, disappears. In its place, you smell a private bouquet, a personal bubble of sweetness. That's the calmness hidden inside the mask. While the world reeks of panic, you breathe roses. Of course, the patient doesn't know this. To them, the beak looks alien, unreadable. They can't see the petals or the tiny sachets of herbs. They just see glass eyes and leather straps. But inside, You're cocooned in scent, and perhaps that cocoon steadied the nerves of doctors who had to walk daily into misery. Here's where imagination adds its little theatre. Picture a marketplace in plague-stricken Paris. Vendors have abandoned their stalls, stray cats weave between barrels, and from one corner a plague doctor appears. His beak is heavy with rosemary and juniper. As he breathes, the herbs release faint clouds of perfume that mingle with the air. You wouldn't notice it from outside, but for him, it's like moving through an invisible garden. A strange, serene contradiction. The smell of a meadow inside, the smell of death outside. People at the time believed in balance, good smells could push back bad smells. That's why homes burned sweet woods and why posies were carried in pockets. Even the famous nursery rhyme "Ring Around the Rosy" echoes this practice. Pockets full of posies meant trying to block the plague's stench. The mask simply extended that idea, concentrating the bouquet directly over your nose. But even here, mockery followed. Some satirical prints teased that doctors stuffed their beaks with whatever junk they could find, including, allegedly, rotten cheese or fermented urine. Do I believe that? Probably not. It smells more like satire than vinegar. Yet it shows how the beak was seen not only as a tool but as a running joke. Imagine townsfolk whispering, "He's got lavender today, must be payday," or "smells like onions, must be broke." Still, the core idea carried calm authority. If people saw you breathing slowly through your herb-filled beak, it signaled control. You weren't panicked. You weren't gasping. You were inhaling order itself, one clove at a time. That steadiness mattered as much as any actual protection. And maybe the strangest thing, some ingredients we laugh at today, vinegar, mint, cloves, actually do have mild antibacterial properties. Not enough to stop the plague, but enough to freshen foul air. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or early science peeking through the cracks. Either way, the doctors inside those masks believed in their garden beaks, and belief has its own calming power. So the next time you picture that beak, don't just see emptiness. Imagine the hidden bouquet, rose petals, mint leaves, cloves, maybe a sponge soaked in vinegar. A little greenhouse of hope perched on a face of leather. A reminder that even in chaos, humans reach for small comforts, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes beautiful, sometimes both. You've peered inside the beak, smelled the herbs, and now it's time to notice the rest of the outfit, the layers of armor that turned a doctor into something halfway between a bird, a knight, and a butcher. The mask may be the star, but the gown, gloves, cane, and glass eyes gave the whole ensemble its uncanny calm. You don't rush into a plague pit dressed like that. You glide in, layered in ritual, untouchable by chaos. Here's the mainstream fact. The classic plague doctor uniform consisted of a long waxed leather coat, tight leather gloves, heavy boots, and a broad-brimmed hat. The surfaces were often coated with suet or wax to repel bad air. A wooden cane was carried to examine patients at a distance, and glass discs were set into the mask to protect the eyes. This was essentially Europe's first hazmat suit. The quirky tidbit. Some doctors took the armor idea so literally that they polished their gowns until they shone like patent leather, making them look like glossy black ravens stalking the streets. Historians still argue whether these uniforms were common across Europe or mostly confined to a few regions like France and Italy, while other countries stuck to simpler cloth coverings. Imagine stepping into that suit piece by piece. First, linen underclothes cling to your skin. Over them goes the leather gown, stiff and heavy, squeaking faintly as you move. Then the gloves, tight at the wrists, the boots snug at the calves, all tied with cords. Finally, the wide-brimmed hat perches on your head like the finishing touch of a stage costume. Each layer isn't just practical, it's ceremonial. You don't just put on the plague doctor's gown, you transform into the role. The cane deserves its own moment. From the outside, it looks like a prop, but in practice, it was a multi-tool. You used it to lift sheets, prod at swellings, even shoo away desperate townsfolk who got too close. Picture yourself tapping a patient's side gently, counting ribs, or lifting a chin without ever using your bare hands. It made you look clinical, detached, almost robotic. And that calm detachment was exactly what people needed to see, even if the reality inside the gown was sweat, exhaustion, and fogged-up glass lenses. Walking in this outfit wasn't easy. The leather squeaked, the beak muffled your breathing, the hat tilted with each step. Yet the effect on bystanders was mesmerizing. Instead of rushing through streets in panic, doctors moved slowly, like armored sentinels. There's a strange serenity in that slowness, like monks processing through a cathedral, their movements measured, deliberate, ritualistic. Of course, ridicule followed them everywhere. Caricatures showed doctors waddling in oversized boots or tripping over their gowns. In Venice, carnival masks mimicked the beak for comedy. Children mocked the cane with makeshift sticks. Yet despite the laughter, the figure remained calm. It had to. The mask gave no expression, the gown creaked steadily, and the cane tapped rhythmically. No matter how chaotic the world outside, the outfit forced you to move with composure. Slip into it for a moment in your imagination. You're standing in a darkened house, patients groaning softly from their beds. The smell is unbearable, sweat, decay, smoke, but inside your beak you breathe mint. Your gloves creak as you adjust your cane. Your eyes peer through round glass, seeing the world in faint distortions, as though through water. You feel heat pressing against your skin under the waxed gown, but outwardly you look still, almost serene. A human covered entirely in leather and glass, transformed into something inhumanly calm. It's almost funny. The suit was designed to repel death, but it also repelled humanity. The moment you stepped into it, you lost your face, your voice softened behind the beak, and your gestures slowed under the leather. You became an emblem. And perhaps that was the point. In times of terror, people don't always want a friend, they want a symbol of control. That's what the layers of armor provided. So the plague doctor wasn't just a healer or a caretaker. He was a walking ritual, a black-robed bird gliding through empty streets, silent except for the faint tap of a cane. He looked terrifying, yes, but he also looked untouchably calm, exactly the paradox that made the mask and gown endure as one of history's strangest uniforms. The more time you spend watching the beaked figure, the clearer one detail becomes. Calm wasn't just an accident of the costume, it was the performance. Plague doctors didn't sprint or shout. They walked. Slowly. They carried themselves like guardians of order, even when the world was falling apart around them. You imagine narrow streets echoing with coughs and cries, and through it all, one figure gliding with the steady rhythm of a pendulum clock. The mainstream fact is that plague doctors were often described as moving with deliberate slowness, partly because of the restrictive outfit, but also because they wanted to project authority. They weren't miracle workers, they couldn't cure the plague, but they could embody calm control. The quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest that children in plague cities nicknamed them ravens of death not only because of their masks but also because of their odd, unhurried pace, which looked like birds strutting. Historians still argue whether this measured movement was intentional or just a side effect of suffocating leather gowns and fogged-up glass lenses. Picture a square in Rome or Marseille. The air is thick with the smell of burning juniper, an attempt to cleanse whole streets with smoke. People shuffle past, whispering prayers. In the center, a plague doctor appears. His cane taps on the stones, tap, pause, tap, while his gown sways slightly with each step. He doesn't flinch when someone coughs near him. He doesn't hurry when a body is carted past. Instead, he seems suspended in his own calm bubble, a still image moving through chaos. This calmness wasn't just for show, it was practical. Running or panicking in heavy leather would leave you drenched in sweat, vulnerable to fainting, or worse, tearing the seams that supposedly sealed you off from the plague. By moving slowly, doctors preserved their strength and their dignity. From the outside, it looked almost holy, as if they were monks performing a ritual instead of men desperately hoping the herbs in their beaks would keep death away. Imagine yourself wearing the outfit in summer heat. The gown clings, the beak fills with hot, damp air. Each step feels like a small labor. But rather than stumble, you pace yourself. You make slowness a style. Each deliberate movement becomes part of the role. You're not a sweaty doctor trapped in leather, you're the calm sentinel of the city. That's the trick of the mask, it forces composure, whether you want it or not. Of course, people noticed. Some were comforted by the sight, believing these crow-faced figures were guardians against the plague. Others were unsettled, whispering that they looked like angels of death marking houses for the grave. Both views share a common thread. The doctor's aura of calm made them seem more than human, a figure set apart from panic. The calm performance also extended to gestures. Instead of touching patients directly, doctors pointed with their canes, lifted sheets gently, or tapped swollen buboes like one might test fruit at a market. Detached, clinical, unhurried. Even when writing notes, the quill scratched paper at a steady rhythm, not rushed like a frantic scribe. Every action whispered the same message, I am not afraid. And yet, inside the mask, fear was very real. Doctors wrote later of their dread, their exhaustion, their doubts. But the uniform gave them a script to follow: slowness, calmness, order. It's not so different from how modern nurses or firefighters learn to keep their voices even during emergencies. The costume made them actors in a grim play, and the role demanded serenity. So as you picture that lone figure crossing a square filled with panic, notice the paradox. He looks terrifying, yet also comforting. He embodies death, yet also defiance of it. He is calm not because he feels calm, but because the mask requires it. And in a world where chaos reigned, that calm performance mattered more than any cure. If you peel back the mystery of the plague doctor just a little further, you'll discover that beneath the beak, the gown, and the calm performance was something far more bureaucratic: business. Strange as it sounds, plague doctors were less like miracle healers and more like temporary civil servants. Cities and towns often hired them on contract, paying a salary to ensure anyone would at least pretend to impose order on the catastrophe. Here's the mainstream fact: many plague doctors were actually municipal employees. They weren't always highly trained physicians. Sometimes they were young, inexperienced, or even out-of-work medical students desperate for employment. Town councils would draw up contracts specifying duties, examining the sick, recording deaths, even doing autopsies when the law allowed. The quirky tidbit: a few contracts survive where the doctors were explicitly forbidden from charging patients for treatment, but they were allowed to accept bribes for writing favorable health reports. Historians still argue whether this corruption was the exception or the rule, but it's hard not to smirk when you imagine a plague doctor filling out invoices while people keeled over outside. The work wasn't glamorous. Picture yourself being summoned to a plague-stricken household. You step inside, cane in hand, and the family doesn't beg for medicine, they beg for legal clarity. Who owns the land if the father dies? Who inherits the shop? The doctor's presence meant more than a diagnosis, it was a kind of notarized witness to death. Many towns required doctors to record who was sick, who had perished, and sometimes even to confirm whether a death was indeed plague-related. That way, property transfers could move along smoothly. Morbid, yes, but practical. And so, the plague doctor's ledger was often more important than his bag of herbs. He might spend hours documenting wills, debts, and inheritances. Imagine dipping your quill into ink, scratching names onto parchment, and realizing that most of the people you're writing about won't live to read it. If medicine failed, paperwork endured. This businesslike role also explains why towns wanted the mask and costume to project calm. A community drowning in fear didn't just need healing, it needed an image of authority. The beak and leather weren't just protection, they were branding. They said, "Here is an official, someone under contract, a figure of order who can help shepherd society through collapse." Of course, plague doctors sometimes negotiated their contracts aggressively. Some demanded higher pay for risk, or free lodging, or even hazard bonuses in the form of wine rations. One Venetian doctor requested a stipend that included chickens, which he claimed were necessary for his constitution. You can almost hear him now. "Listen, if I'm going to poke buboes all day, I at least deserve fresh eggs." The cane, too, had its administrative uses. Beyond poking patients and nudging clothes aside, it was a symbol of office. A tap on the floor might announce your arrival. A pointed gesture might finalize a death inspection. Even without words, the cane marked you as an arbiter of the plague's reality. And yet, all this bureaucracy carried its own irony. Imagine families looking up at you, dressed like a bird of doom, while you carefully calculate witness fees. Imagine scrawling cause of death, suspected plague again and again, while the body in front of you tells a story no one dares debate. Calm performance, yes, but also accountancy, notarization, and the sort of paperwork nightmares you thought you left behind in the modern world. What's most surreal is how the system worked. People genuinely respected the mask not just as a healer's garb but as an official stamp of municipal authority. You weren't simply a doctor, you were a city's hired representative of death's tally. And the more calmly you carried yourself, the more credible that strange business became. So when you imagine the plague doctor tonight, don't picture him always clutching herbs or sprinkling vinegar. Picture him with a ledger under his arm, a quill in his pocket, and a town council waiting impatiently for his weekly reports. The mask made him look like a guardian, but the contract made him more like a bureaucrat. In the end, the business of plague was less about saving lives and more about keeping society from unraveling completely. You step aside from the official streets and municipal offices, letting your eyes drift over woodcuts and engravings from the time. The plague doctor isn't just medicine anymore, he's becoming a character in public imagination, a symbol ripe for satire. Streets and markets were already full of caricatures of officials, merchants, and clergy, but the beaked figure offered something new, terrifying, yet absurd enough to laugh at. The mainstream fact is that the plague doctor appears frequently in 17th century prints, often exaggerated. Artists loved to emphasize the long beak, oversized gown, and stiff posture. Sometimes he's shown wielding his cane like a scepter, pointing at the sick, while ordinary townsfolk flee in horror or mockery. The quirky tidbit. Some satirical illustrations depicted the beak as a purse for coins, suggesting the doctor might sneak extra payments while examining patients. Historians still argue whether these images were widespread social commentary or confined to a few urban artistic circles, but they show how public perception blurred fear and humor. Picture yourself wandering a busy market in Venice. Stalls are half empty, carts abandoned, and the smell of roasted nuts mingles with smoke from burning herbs. You spot a caricature hanging from a stall, the plague doctor with the body of a goose and the head of a crow, bending dramatically over a patient who is clearly more dead than alive. People laugh quietly, yet you notice a nervous edge to the mirth. Humor, after all, is a way to manage fear. The street theater of satire served a dual purpose. On one hand, it mocked authority figures who seemed powerless against the plague. On the other, it gave townspeople a way to process terror without panicking. They could laugh at the elongated beak, exaggerated boots, and stiff cane, while still acknowledging the figure's solemn authority. The mask was now a stage prop, and reality was a performance. Imagine a carnival in Florence. Someone dons a beak mask for fun, mimicking the slow, careful steps of real plague doctors. Children chase each other around fountains, giggling, pretending the crow is after them. Even in play, the figure retains some of its original calmness. The absurdity is softened by ritual. The slow, exaggerated movements mimic the serious gestures of actual doctors, teaching through humor what seriousness once conveyed. This transition from terror to satire is part of the mask's charm. It could inhabit multiple spaces at once, a tool for protection, a bureaucrat's uniform, a terrifying omen, and now a comic figure in public art. You might even see it in woodcuts depicting dance of death scenes, where skeletons escort masked doctors alongside kings, merchants, and peasants. The beak here is less about herbs or miasma, it's a symbol, a visual shorthand for disease, death, and social order. And yet, the calmness persists. Even when mocked, the beaked figure doesn't panic. It doesn't sprint or shout. In satirical art, in caricature, it remains poised, upright, measured, still the bird-like sentinel moving at its own tempo. The humor doesn't diminish authority, it transforms it into something accessible, something that allows the public to engage with fear safely. So as you trace these images, note the duality. The beak can terrify and amuse simultaneously. Streets that once whispered death approaches now murmur look, the crow doctor waddles. The mask's legacy as a symbol of calm amid chaos is reinforced not just through practice, but through art, satire, and public imagination. It teaches a subtle lesson: even in absurdity, the performance of composure can soothe collective anxiety. You start noticing how the plague doctor's mask isn't uniform across Europe. Each region seems to have added its own twist, like dialects in a language of leather, glass, and herbs. In Venice, the gowns are sleek and almost ceremonial. In Germany, the masks are austere, emphasizing function over form. In France, practicality and flair blend together. The bird-like figure becomes a quiet symbol of regional identity as much as a medical tool. The mainstream fact is that mask designs varied significantly. Venetian doctors often preferred shorter beaks with elaborate floral or ornamental arrangements inside, reflecting the city's love for pageantry. German plague doctors sometimes had longer, straighter beaks, prioritizing the maximum distance from patients. The quirky tidbit: some French doctors reportedly decorated their beaks with tiny gilded studs or etched initials of their city, turning them into walking business cards. Historians still argue whether these variations were intentional stylistic choices or simply adaptations to local climate and materials. Picture yourself in a German town in winter. The air bites at your cheeks, the streets slick with snow, and your beak mask points forward like a narrow spear. The long beak keeps you physically separated from patients, yes, but it also sends a message: methodical, disciplined, cautious. Over in Venice, by contrast, masks glint in the sun, petals peeking out, leather polished to shine in canal reflections. The same function, protection from miasma, but expressed through different aesthetics. Even the cane follows regional quirks. In Italy, it's often curved at the top, like a shepherd's staff, used to gesture gracefully or guide a patient. In Northern Europe, it's straighter and more utilitarian, tapping sharply against cobblestones, emphasizing authority and distance. The ensemble becomes a kind of visual dialect, immediately recognizable to locals. You know a Venetian plague doctor from a mile away, not just by beak length, but by posture, decoration, and cadence. This regionality also extends to rituals surrounding the mask. In some areas, doctors anointed their boots with scented oils before entering plague houses. Elsewhere, they carried small bells, letting patients know the healer had arrived without approaching too closely. The variations are minor in function but massive in cultural impact. Imagine walking through European cities during a plague outbreak and recognizing different towns' doctors at a glance. It's almost like reading flags. Each variation conveys not just identity, but intent and competence. And yet, through all these differences, calmness remains constant. Whether Venice, Germany, or France, the movement is measured, the posture deliberate, the gaze, hidden behind glass, neutral. Even in flamboyant Venetian masks, the serenity of the figure reassures, signals authority, and maintains ritualized composure. The calm isn't an accident, it's embedded in the silhouette, no matter the beak length or ornamentation. In a way, the mask becomes a language of its own. You don't need words to communicate professionalism, control, or ritual. You simply wear the outfit, walk slowly, let the cane tap lightly, and the message is clear. You are prepared, untouchable, and calm in the face of fear. So as you drift through these different cities, notice the subtle cues. The mask shifts in style, but its essence, controlled, measured, composed, remains. Regional flair may add sparkle or rigidity, but the serenity under the leather and glass is universal. And that quiet consistency is what allowed the beak mask to become a lasting symbol, spanning borders, climates, and centuries. You overhear debates now, echoing across centuries, like faint whispers in candlelit libraries. Scholars argue over the plague doctor mask's meaning. Was it purely practical, a superstition dressed in leather, or something performative designed to assert control over terrified communities? No single answer satisfies every historian, and that uncertainty is part of the mask's enduring fascination. The mainstream fact is that many historians consider the mask a product of miasma theory, designed to filter bad air with aromatic herbs and leather layers. But the quirky tidbit. Some fringe theories suggest the mask was actually a social performance, a way for communities to visibly identify authority figures who could manage death, even if they couldn't prevent it. Picture a kind of medieval cosplay, albeit one with real stakes. Historians still argue whether the mask's primary function was medicinal, symbolic, or somewhere in between. Imagine yourself in a heated debate with a colleague in a quiet library, parchment spread before you. You gesture to an engraving of a long-beaked figure, and your friend argues it's all superstition, useless herbs stuffed into leather. You counter that the calm authority it projected likely saved more mental anguish than any potion could. Neither of you fully wins, but the discussion itself illuminates the mask's layered history. This ambiguity also extends to urban legends of the period. Some tales claim the beak's length was precisely calculated to keep doctors a plague's safe distance from patients. Others insist it was a symbolic exaggeration, meant to mark a figure who walked between the worlds of life and death. Some even suggest that the herbs inside the beak were intended to protect the soul, not the body. Whether practical or poetic, the result was the same, a figure that exuded calm, competence, and distance. You wander through the streets of Lyon in your imagination, mask strapped firmly, cane tapping the stones. Villagers whisper and point. Some cross themselves, others nod in respect. The mask doesn't explain itself. You carry no words, no pamphlets, just leather, glass, and herbs. And yet, it communicates authority, protection, and serenity. The mystery of its purpose becomes part of its power. The calmness here is subtle but profound. You move slowly not just because of leather and wax, but because the mask enforces a ritualized pace. Every gesture, every measured step, is part of a performance, whether or not you're consciously aware of it. This composed movement reassures patients, townsfolk, and even yourself, offering psychological protection alongside physical measures. And the debates continue, even today. Some scholars insist the mask was a purely rational attempt to block disease, others emphasize the social theater. You can picture medieval doctors nodding along in agreement with either view, calmly accepting that history will wrestle with their legacy long after they're gone. The mask doesn't need to defend itself. It simply is a calm, bird-like enigma navigating streets full of fear and death. So, as you imagine those debates flickering in candlelight, Remember the quiet authority embedded in every curve of leather, every glass lens, every herb-stuffed beak. Whether science, superstition, or performance, the mask's serene presence shaped how communities faced the uncontrollable. You begin to notice that the plague doctor mask had a life beyond medicine. Once the immediate terror of the plague subsided, the beak didn't disappear, it migrated into culture, art, and even carnival traditions. The mask became a symbol, a costume, a curious mix of fear, humor, and ritualized calm that outlived the outbreaks themselves. The mainstream fact: by the late 17th century, the mask appeared in woodcuts, theater, and festival costumes, particularly in Venice. Carnival goers wore beaks not for protection but for pageantry, turning what was once a medical device into a theatrical accessory. The quirky tidbit: some Venetian masks were stuffed with rose petals and perfumed so strongly that bystanders claimed they could smell them before the wearer even arrived. Historians still argue whether these carnival masks directly evolved from plague doctors' outfits or were independently inspired by the same bird-like aesthetics that fascinated European culture. Imagine yourself stepping into a Venetian piazza during Carnival. The city hums with music and chatter, gondolas sway gently in the canals, and masked figures glide through the crowd. Among them, a beaked doctor-like mask floats past. It's long, ornate, absurdly theatrical. But somehow it carries the same calm authority as the original plague doctor, just displaced into festivity. The mask now communicates mystery and elegance instead of dread. Even in theater, the mask gained significance. Stage productions depicted death, disease, or moral allegories using bird-faced figures reminiscent of plague doctors. The hollow beak became a symbol of fate, inevitability, and observation. Audience members laughed at its absurdity, shivered at its connotations, and marveled at the careful ritual of movement required to bring it to life. The calmness persisted in these performances. Actors had to glide slowly, hands poised, voices measured, maintaining the solemn cadence that had originally protected doctors. Beyond art and festivals, the mask also appeared in satirical prints. Cartoonish exaggerations highlighted the absurdity of a long-beaked figure poking at bodies or gliding through empty streets. Yet the mask's cultural presence reinforced its historical role, a reminder that even in chaos, humans seek structure, pattern, and ritual. By codifying fear into a recognizable, almost iconic figure, the mask transformed terror into a story we could engage with safely. Here's a thought: the mask's journey from medical tool to cultural icon mirrors how societies deal with trauma. Objects, roles, and rituals migrate from necessity to symbol. The bird-faced doctor becomes both warning and entertainment, simultaneously teaching caution, inspiring respect, and provoking laughter. And in all these contexts, the serene, measured presence, the slow glide, the deliberate tap of the cane, the silent authority remains intact. Even centuries later, you can see the calmness encoded in modern depictions. In films, illustrations, and collectibles, the beak tilts forward, the eyes peer through glass, and the cane rests lightly in hand. The figure still embodies that odd paradox, eerie yet composed, theatrical yet solemn. The mask isn't just history, it's a study in the human need to transform fear into ritual, to move slowly and deliberately through chaos. So as you wander through carnival squares, theaters, and woodcuts, remember the mask's journey. It didn't vanish with the plague. It shifted forms, from a literal shield against miasma to a cultural emblem that carries centuries of calm authority, absurdity, and careful ritual. In that transformation, its quiet magic persists, bridging the real and the imagined, the terrifying and the performative. The mask story doesn't stop at festivals and prints, it seeps into collective memory, folklore, and legend. In small towns and villages, the plague doctor became almost mythic, a figure told about in hushed tones as both protector and omen. You can picture grandparents describing him to children not to terrify, but to instill a sense of respect for order and ritual, for the odd calm he represented. The mainstream fact is that the plague doctor's image persisted in European folklore long after outbreaks subsided. Tales circulated of mysterious figures appearing at the edges of villages, their beaks gleaming in moonlight, tapping canes lightly against stones. The quirky tidbit. Some stories claimed that the herbs inside the beak could ward off more than disease, even curses or bad luck. Historians still argue whether these tales were localized superstition or widespread cultural motifs, but the persistence of the figure is undeniable. Imagine walking through a foggy forest near a village, lantern in hand, and glimpsing the silhouette of a bird-faced figure in the mist. Your heart quickens, but there's also a strange reassurance. The mask's calm, deliberate posture signals that order is still possible, even amid uncertainty. The legend transforms terror into a manageable narrative. The figure is no longer a random threat, but a familiar guardian who maintains ritual, pace, and composure. This blend of fear and comfort echoes the mask's original purpose. You remember the layers of leather, the herb-filled beak, the cane's deliberate tap. Even in folklore, these elements persist, emphasizing the same paradox. The figure terrifies but reassures, embodies death yet represents control, moves through chaos yet projects calm. You realize that the image itself, rather than any scientific efficacy, was the true gift of the plague doctor. The mask also inspired art beyond Europe's plague years. Gothic paintings, engravings, and later literature used bird-faced figures as metaphors for disease, inevitability, and even moral judgment. They appear in allegories of death, moral warnings, or cautionary tales. The quirky, sometimes humorous exaggerations lingered alongside solemn depictions, preserving the duality of fear and ritualized serenity. Historians still debate how much these artistic representations influenced public perception of real plague doctors versus reinforcing myths. Imagine sitting by a hearth in a post-plague village. Children ask about the strange figures they've seen in town stories. You describe the beak, the slow gait, the cane tapping on cobblestones, the herbs inside. You emphasize the calm, the measured steps, the ritual of movement. Through storytelling, the figure transforms from a medical necessity into a tool for understanding and managing fear. The calmness inherent in the mask's design, performance, and legacy underscores a subtle human truth. We create symbols to navigate uncertainty. By embedding ritual, pace, and measured behavior into the bird-faced silhouette, communities then and now find a way to face mortality with composure. Even centuries later, the legend of the plague doctor teaches us about order, ceremony, and the comforting power of calm in the midst of chaos. So as you walk through whispered tales and misty forests, the figure of the plague doctor remains a bridge between reality and imagination, mortality and ritual, terror and serene performance. You can almost hear the cane tapping, the faint scent of herbs in the air, and feel the measured heartbeat of centuries-old calm. You start to notice how the plague doctor mask quietly influenced modern design and imagination. Its silhouette appears in everything from Halloween costumes to steampunk fashion, horror films, and video games. Even centuries later, the calm, measured presence encoded in leather, glass, and herbs continues to captivate and unsettle. The mainstream fact is that designers and storytellers often reference the bird-like beak and glass eyes when creating characters associated with disease, death, or secrecy. The quirky tidbit. Some modern cosplay communities have gone so far as to refill beaks with scented herbs or LED lights, transforming the mask from historical medical tool into theatrical statement. Historians still argue whether these modern interpretations honor the original function or simply aestheticize terror for entertainment, but they undeniably preserve the mask's visual and symbolic power. Picture yourself at a convention today. People in elaborate costumes glide through halls. A beaked figure stands quietly in a corner, cane in hand, leather gown gleaming under artificial lights. There's no immediate threat, but the aura of calm authority is palpable. Even in a crowd of noise and chaos, the figure moves deliberately, embodies order, and silently commands attention. You feel the same paradox the original doctors did, unsettling yet oddly reassuring. This modern fascination isn't limited to costume. Horror films often use the mask to signal an uncanny presence. Video games cast it on characters who move slowly, strategically, observing and acting from a position of quiet control. Artists depict the beak as both grotesque and elegant, bridging centuries-old design with contemporary aesthetic sensibilities. The calmness embedded in its movement, posture, and structure carries over seamlessly. Even in literature and folklore retellings, the mask's legacy persists. Authors use it to embody inevitability, rationality amid panic, or even the human need for ritualized symbols in crises. The measured, deliberate pace that characterized the original plague doctors, slow steps, careful cane gestures, herbs tucked into a beak, becomes a shorthand for calm professionalism in a chaotic narrative. Imagine creating a character inspired by the historical mask. Every design choice, length of beak, polish of leather, angle of the glass lenses affects perception. You're crafting calmness through visual cues, a subtle psychological language inherited from centuries of plague-era ritual. And in that translation, you understand why the mask endures. Its calmness isn't just functional, it's performative, aesthetic, and deeply human. Even humor finds its place. Memes, cartoons, and playful art reinterpret the mask without losing its essence. Whether terrifying, whimsical, or absurd, the bird-faced figure carries the same paradoxical aura: controlled, deliberate, composed. People laugh, shiver, or marvel, but in every reaction, they acknowledge the authority embedded in the design. So as you observe these modern echoes, notice how the calm legacy endures. Leather, glass, herbs, and measured movement stripped of plague, relocated to stage or screen, they still teach the same lesson. Ritualized composure in the face of chaos is a timeless tool. The beak mask isn't just history, it's a living study in calm performance, surviving centuries of imagination, culture, and human psychology. Now you step into the final layer of the plague doctor's legacy, memory itself. The mask has survived not only in museums, woodcuts, and festivals, but in the collective imagination as a symbol of measured response to fear, a testament to humanity's attempts to control the uncontrollable. It reminds us that even in crisis, calm ritual, deliberate movement, and symbolic authority matter as much as action. The mainstream fact: surviving plague doctor masks are rare, often preserved in Italian or French collections, and scholars study them to understand both design and historical context. The quirky tidbit: one museum displays a mask where the beak has been deliberately shortened, supposedly to fit modern heads, making it look almost like a miniature crow perched awkwardly on a human face. Historians still argue whether such modifications obscure authenticity or reveal the mask's evolving role as both artifact and cultural icon. Imagine yourself walking through a dimly lit museum hall. Spotlights glint off leather, the glass lenses catch reflections of visitors' faces, and the beak seems to lean forward, even now, as if anticipating a question or measuring the room. You notice the calm posture embedded in centuries-old photographs and preserved artifacts, the slow tap of an imagined cane, the deliberate arc of leather sleeves. The mask continues to communicate composure, even centuries later, in a quiet whisper of history. The mask's calmness is more than visual. It conveys human strategies for coping with chaos, structured attire, ritualized movement, psychological preparation, and symbolic authority. Walking past it, you realize that the figure embodies centuries of learned behavior, slow steps, deliberate gestures, and the reassuring presence of someone who has internalized both fear and response. Even when stripped of function, the performance of calm persists. Across centuries, the mask has also inspired creative reinterpretations. Art, literature, and even mental health metaphors borrow from its image. Writers depict it as a metaphor for controlled anxiety, a figure navigating internal plagues of fear with measured steps and herbal protection. Designers and educators use it to teach ritual, preparedness, and symbolic authority. The beak is no longer just about disease, it's about poise under pressure. And finally, imagine the paradox in your mind one last time. A figure that was terrifying, comical, bureaucratic, and ritualistic all at once now rests in your imagination. Its calmness remains, teaching lessons beyond medicine, measured response, ritual, performance, and the quiet authority that comes from facing chaos with preparation. Even centuries later, it asks us to move deliberately, breathe calmly, and observe carefully. The plague doctor mask may have started as leather, herbs, and wax, but it has become something larger, a timeless emblem of calm amid uncertainty, a testament to humanity's efforts to navigate fear, and a reminder that composure itself is a tool, sometimes the most effective one we have. You lean back now, letting your eyes close for a moment, feeling the soft hum of a fan or the quiet rustle of sheets. The plague doctor, once a figure of terror, becomes a symbol of order. You imagine the leather gown, the beak stuffed with herbs, the slow tap of the cane on cobblestone. Each detail fades into gentle memory, like shadows moving softly across a wall. Think of the calmness it carried, preserved in art, folklore, and imagination. The mask taught measured movement, ritual, and composure. It was terrifying, absurd, bureaucratic, and beautiful all at once, yet through all its paradoxes, it offered reassurance. Even when stripped of function, it continues to whisper the lesson: move deliberately, act calmly, face chaos with preparation. You feel yourself breathing slowly now, inhaling as if the herbs were still tucked under the beak, exhaling stress and tension. Let the rhythm of centuries of calm settle around you, a soft cloak of human ingenuity and ritual. The streets, the markets, the haunted forests, even carnival squares, they all vanish gently, leaving only the serene echo of measured steps, careful gestures, and the quiet authority of someone who faced the unthinkable and moved through it with grace. Let that serenity linger. Let the absurdity and the history mingle in your mind, shaping a soft, reflective end to the journey. The plague doctor fades into shadow, a guardian of calm, leaving you in the quiet space between history and imagination, ready to drift into your own restful night.